Hi everyone, I'm Jerry Shikuma, ACC's Home and Community-Based Programs Administrator. Welcome to our special speaker series. Today we are featuring Maryellen Burns. But before I bring Maryellen on, I just wanted to let everybody know that next week we are going to be having a special event, a big day of cooking. It's 1 week from now, next week, Thursday. And you should see the slide on the screen right now from 12 to 4. So it's 4 hours of non-stop cooking demos with chefs and cooks from our ACC community who will be doing all kinds of different foods from different ethnic groups. It'll be a lot of fun and it'll be exciting. It'll be a hybrid program as well. So if you're interested in trying to attend in person, please contact us. You can sign up at our website at accsv.org. And now this event is a lead up to our big Days of Giving telethon that's going to be on May 4th and May 5th. We've been doing this telethon for the past couple of years now, and it's just so much fun, full of entertainment and good storytelling. I hope you all will join in. If you're not familiar with the Big Days of Giving or the Big Day of Giving, it is an opportunity for people around the Sacramento region to support their favorite nonprofits. It's an event that's put on by the Sacramento Region Community Foundation. And last year we did really well in our telethon, so we're doing it bigger this year with 2 days on May 4th and May 5th from 4 to 8 p.m. each night. And I really hope if you've been enjoying any of our programs, which by the way, we've been able to put on in part because of the funding we received during our last year's Big Day of Giving. If you've been enjoying those programs, or if you know of a family member or friend who you think might really benefit or enjoy these programs, I hope that you will support us and get the word out about us to your friends and families and acquaintances. Please support us on the Big Day of Giving. And now, it's my pleasure to bring on Maryellen Burns. She is a well-known food historian and local homegrown author.
Thank you.
Last time that Maryellen was here, you talked a lot about the immigrants in Sacramento and their impact on our food history and culture. And today we're going to zone in a little bit more and talk about the Chinese and their impacts, right, on the Northern California wine industry.
Yes.
But before I let you go into detail about that, I also heard that you'll be coming back again in June, right? And that time it's going to be a little bit of a different kind of presentation. So tell me a little bit about that. Yeah.
I want to thank Jerry and everyone else for inviting me today. I have to say that there's nothing worse than just staring into a camera and talking to people for 45 minutes. So next time we're going to be exploring some of the incredible women who impacted our food history in Sacramento. Catherine Kitchen from the Sacramento Bee, little Julia Child, who actually was at a cooking school here. Elaine Korn, who is the wife of David Sue, who's going to be featured next week in the Big Day of Cooking. But I'm going to actually have some volunteers, all non-professionals that are going to portray, or at least do readers' theater and tell the story in their own words, rather than me just talk and talk and talk.
That sounds like fun. So we're actually going to have people here in character, it sounds like, and telling the stories from that point of view.
Absolutely.
I can't wait.
And we're going to actually create one of the dishes. Catherine Kitchen was in the Sacramento Bee for years and years, started off during World War II, or just before World War II. So we're going to actually recreate one of her recipes.
Ooh, that sounds great. Well, okay, but that's next time, and that's June.
Next time.
Do we know the
3rd,
date on that?
I think, or June 2nd.
June 2nd. Okay,
so please sign up, and it is a hybrid, so we're hoping that a few people will actually come and be part of the audience.
Right. Okay, great. So that's in June, but for today, we get to learn about Northern California wine industry, and I have to admit that I hadn't really thought a lot about the Chinese influence on that until I heard about your presentation today. So I'm looking forward to learning lots of interesting new to me ideas and stories, but
Great.
I know that you have a lot of experience. All right,
Thank
so
you
take it
so
away.
much, Jerry.
Sure, thank you.
So today we are going to be talking about the Chinese roots in Northern California's wine industry. And as we said in the description earlier, Napa, Sonoma, and the foothills of Northern California, the stories that are usually told are of the German, Irish, and Italian immigrants' role in the wine industry, from Gallo, which is a name that we know well, Martini, Sebastiani, and then the German wines, which I'm going to be talking about as well. But most of us are really unaware that it was the labor of Chinese in the 1860s to 1880s that really built up the industry, especially in Sonoma and in Napa. They also were here in Northern California. They worked in our fields as well. I'll touch on it just a little bit, including a lot of vineyards in Marysville. I'm not going to go into much detail about the early peoples. The native peoples actually started the wine industry here, along with Mexican Californios. But I'll touch on it just really briefly. But I did want to say that it was the Chinese that really cleared the land for the vineyards. They planted the orchards. They built incredible wine cellars and caves to cool the wine. And some of them actually became vintners and were able to work with the grapes themselves. So their contributions have largely been forgotten. In a few minutes, I have to say that we'll launch into this, but I really felt that it was important to say a little bit more about me and how I came to uncovering these stories, and also the difficulty that it's been finding original documentation for the Chinese. So it's just a little over 30 years ago that I was asked if I would help save Knight Foundry, which is the oldest still continuously operating machine shop and foundry in the United States. We were lucky enough to get it on the Smithsonian's list of the 10 most important structures for that year. But what I loved about working for Knight Foundry is that Knight Foundry not only preserved the buildings, but really preserved the stories and especially the artisan skills and history of place, and told the stories of ordinary people whose voices are really seldom told. And I can't begin to tell you how exciting, the joy that I first experienced when I was able to see my first pour. I had seen small ones at an art foundry, but this was the first time that I was actually able to myself create a mold using sand, just like the sand cast candles that we all did in the 70s, and then see molten lead from scrap be poured into the mold, and then to watch it solidify. And that was just super, super exciting to me. And sorry. So in the 4 or 5 years that I remained involved in that project, I had the really good fortune of meeting a historian by the name of David Weitzman. He has created, he's still with us, he's created a whole series of wonderful children's books. I recommend that you get them, recalling a time when young people readily apprenticed to their grandparents and their parents. They watched, they emulated, and eventually ended up perfecting a craft by which they would be known for all of their lives. They also captured the stories so that those stories could continue. He also introduced me to the concept of personal narratives and oral history. And that is, again, capturing the stories of everyday people through interviews, or better yet, if you can, through video, and conversations. I took that material oftentimes and created talks like this, or maybe a slideshow, a video, a documentary, but made sure that those materials went into an important archive so that these stories weren't lost forever. Now, that approach really led me to focus later on the food, agriculture, and wine and drink industry in California, and specifically the immigrants and how each wave of migration and immigration affected what we grow, cook, and eat. Most labored without recognition. They also worked under incredibly inhumane conditions. They were working at substandard wages. In the case of the Chinese, they weren't even given provisions or food or housing. They had to provide that on their own. And these are the stories, again, that are really hidden from view. One of the reasons that I wanted to tell you this is I really want to encourage each one of you, if you still have a family member that can tell those stories, or even if that person is passed on and you knew that they worked, especially if you're a Chinese and they worked in the railroads, or if they owned a grocery store or had a restaurant, worked in agriculture, to tell those stories that they can be preserved. So I've long been interested in the wine industry in California. I have to admit that I made my first trip to Napa. This is Robert Mondavi's winery in 1971 at the age of 19. That was when Robert Mondavi and his brother had only opened the winery about 5 years earlier. They were the ones who were actually serving the wine. Napa had not grown to the size that it is today. And I just remember Robert Mondavi laughing when I told him that the only wine that was ever served at our house was Manischewitz. And I suddenly realized coming over here, Mogen David wine. So he ended up really laughing about that. One of the things that I loved is that when he described the wine in a way that I didn't expect. So he described a Cabernet as the smell of cassis and plum and eucalyptus and even dirt. So my brother Keith ended up purchasing a bottle for $15. I wasn't going to purchase a bottle because that would get them in trouble. Now that was a full day's salary for me when I was selling cameras at Montgomery Ward's at $2.25 an hour. And we also visited a few other estates. One was Joseph and Alice Heights, and they had established their vineyards 5 years earlier when the population of Napa Valley wineries had been reduced to really the lowest ever. And you will see just, I don't know how many are on this list. There were only 12 that were still in operation, or 24 still in operation. So one of the things that I loved about Sutter Homes, and I brought a bottle of Sutter Homes today, is that I was thinking that it was going to be German owned, and it was actually Mario Trinchero. Mario Trinchero had purchased it from the original owner, and he was so proud because he had just developed a new grape called White Zinfandel that he was going to bottle in 1972. And years later, I would end up helping to organize the White Zinfandel Festival for the Amador wineries with Soban and Shenandoah and others through the Sacramento Bee. I also ended up going to the Lodi Grape Commission and working with some of the wineries down in Lodi. And the reason that I'm bringing this up, and we're going to, one more, thank you. During all of the exploration that I had, from this was 1971 to probably 83 or 85, not at any point had anybody told me or that I had heard that it was actually the Chinese who built the buildings, cleared the land, created the cellars, and did all of the hard work to create all of those. And I had been on tour at Beringer, Inglenook, and Schramsberg, places that should have incorporated that story. That's when I discovered that from 1860 to 1880. The Chinese vineyard workers did literally all of the work in the area, and the story wasn't told probably for almost another 100, or not, not 100 years, but pretty close. So when I discovered this was just by happenstance. I was doing a talk about the Chinese contributions to agriculture in the Delta and levee reclamation when a friend told me about Jack Ding. This is Jack. He's an immigrant, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, from Jingzhou, China. He was leading a movement to be able to honor the Chinese workers by building, along with Gordon Phillips, who was a friend of his who had done a master's, and the Sonoma Penglay Sister City Committee, and they had gone before the Sonoma City Council because they wanted to construct a ting, which is a tile-roofed covered pavilion in a city park to commemorate the Chinese contribution. I was really intrigued, and I went to a talk with Gordon Phillips thinking, this is a story that I really need to pursue, but I didn't get to it quite then. It was not till 2019, 2 years later, that I actually visited Sonoma for a week and toured the Buena Vista Winery and caves, and finally experienced the real enormity of what Chinese laborers had accomplished. I spent some time with the historian there and was ready to meet Jack Ding in person, plus visit the Sonoma Historical Society and the Napa Historical Society, where volunteer historians were just starting to really uncover the stories. So I have to say that my usual way of covering these stories is to spend months trying to quilt them together, to get firsthand accounts, if I can, interviews with the people who did it or the descendants, and get snattered snapshots and historic photos, documents, newspaper articles, and other artifacts that family had donated to museums and archives. However, with the pandemic, that is still almost impossible to do. Not only is there very little of it, but it's almost impossible to be able to get to a site to be able to do the work. So I want to credit, this is not as much original work as I normally do. I want to thank Jack Ding and Gordon Phillips, Grace Wang Lynch, who is a journalist who uncovered one of the first stories, historian Charles L. Sullivan, and a professor at UC Davis by the name of Cecilia Tsu, that I am hoping will come and do a talk here. And lots of books, including Beasts of the Field, that really tells the story of all the immigrants and the hard work they did. So as I said, what I discovered is that, and this is true of the Transcontinental Railroad, as well as the reclamation, levees, there is very little documentation, lots of reasons for it. Some people said that it was because the Chinese were illiterate. That has been pretty much squashed. It's not true. Most of the people who came were very skilled craftsmen, and most of them were men. But if letters went home in Chinese, they haven't been recovered. There's a lot of work happening in Stanford now to see if they can go back and find out exactly what's happening. There was also, I wanted to mention a period after the 1880s for almost 60 years when, because of Chinese exclusion acts and other acts against the Chinese, a lot of these records were lost. I want to say that I proposed this story to ACC about 3 months ago, and I've been working on it ever since. A procrastinator, as I said, by nature. I discovered just yesterday, while checking up on Jack Ding's efforts to build the memorial, because I wasn't sure it was ever done, this video. And I'm hoping that we can cue it up and show it. It's about 2.5 minutes long.
Deep in a cave that stores and ages wine is a forgotten past known to those who come to Buena Vista Winery in Sonoma County.
The late 1850s to the 1870s, they primarily were Chinese laborers.
The hands of low-wage laborers from China helped build the Sonoma wine industry while it was still in its infancy. These images of Chinese workers on the walls of Buena Vista Winery are reminders of their significance.
They did all of the working of the fields, the plowing, the actual digging, planting, and then the management of the vineyards. They definitely worked at the other properties, but Buena Vista was known to have the largest Chinese labor camp north of San Francisco.
The Chinese workers dug these caves more than 150 years ago. What remains are these pick marks. The rocks from these caves were used as building blocks for the winemaking facilities at the time. This is one of 2 buildings of the original that remains today.
A couple of my friends, they show me the so-called Chinese rock fence. People, the local people still remember, and the Chinese laborers did something for them.
Their stories passed down by word of mouth among the locals. Historians knew about them, but what happened to them is uncertain.
We don't understand where they went once they left the city of Sonoma. We don't know a whole lot of names.
Chinese immigrants at the time experienced violent anti-Chinese sentiment, boycotts, and in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law that restricted immigration into the United States.
They work here, they live here. Most of them, they die here. They don't have them a place. They didn't have them a place to be buried.
This was sort of a forgotten history of Sonoma, and then there was, we had a sort of a shameful history regarding the Asian Exclusion Act, and people wanted to make things right.
To honor these nameless laborers, the Sonoma Penglai China Sister City Committee is raising money to build this Chinese pavilion in the city of Sonoma. Ding says this would also be a piece of history for the new Chinese who are here.
We can see a lot of investors from China. They purchase the wineries, they purchase the properties. That is the reason why we want to build up this kind of physical structure, just to remind the people, remind us of the history, and let us know who we are, where we came from.
So the efforts of those who helped build the wine industry here will not be forgotten. Elizabeth Lee, VOA News, Sonoma, California.
So thank you. I'm so glad that I was able to find that. I have to mention that I also just discovered yesterday, because I hadn't been in contact with Jack Ding, that he is now the mayor of Sonoma. Pretty good for an immigrant to California from China since 1993. One of the things is to really understand how the wine industry began. We do have to start with the gold rush. When gold was first discovered in California in 1848, almost 20,000 Chinese came. There is a lot of misinformation about the work that they did. They were very good miners, actually, and that brought problems because they were, again, harassed. There was a miner's tax that was against the Chinese that was not given against white people. So that was passed by the California legislature. So a lot of them ended up having to leave. 90% of the labor of the railroads was actually 90% Chinese on our side. They worked under harsh and really dangerous conditions, yet with really increasing discrimination and decreasing opportunities. And after the railroad left, many returned to China, but not as many as we'd expect, probably less than 40%. Others stayed behind to build the structures that we find in the Napa and Sonoma Valley, the stone walls, the great stone barns, and the fine old homes, and of course in reclamation in the Delta. Others remained to clear roads for farming and plant prunes and harvest grapes. What the employers found was that they were much more convenient and cheaper to hire Chinese laborers through Chinese foremen or labor contractors called China bosses, as the labor contractors assumed all supervisory and manager responsibilities. The Chinese workers formed into clans, much like unions, each with its own overlord who contracted work for them and provided housing and food. And again, the reason we don't know very many of the names is usually just the contractor or the laborer is the only name that remains. So that brings us to 1857. And this is a wealthy Hungarian named Augustin Herrazi. I'm going to mispronounce his name, I'm sure. Often called the father of California viticulture. He was largely responsible for introducing the Chinese into the Sonoma viticulture industry. He had purchased a ranch called Buena Vista, which is called Good View, with the vision of introducing winemaking from his native country. Winemaking is much more labor intensive than almost any other crop, and he soon discovered that finding workers to plant vines was not as easy as he would expect. First of all, the vines themselves were only about 1.5 feet off the ground, not the tall ones that we see today. White workers didn't want to do the work, but Chinese workers would be willing to do the back-breaking work that it took to literally lean down and plant and also to cut the grapes. This would be true of Filipinos, Japanese, and Chinese in the asparagus industry as well. One of the things is that when Chinese labor, because of the laws, became very scarce, and they had to hire, again, Italian or German or Irish workers, that's when we started getting these large trellises. So who he turned to was a labor contractor called Ho Po. He was from San Francisco. He hired 150 workers. I have to say, without being able to get to the San Francisco Historical Society and some of the societies there, I've been not able to find as much about Ho Po as I had wanted. But they ended up working and especially built the wine cellars and the wine caves and actually made wine under his direction. In 1860, they planted 70,000 vines. In 1861, they planted 135,000. And the loose dirt was carried out literally by woven baskets. And my apologies for using terminology that is offensive, but an account in the Daily Alta California of July 23rd, 1863, stated the following. The overseer Attila Herrazi worked 30 Chinamen grubbing oak saplings on a steep hill, 4 Chinamen filling, corking, wiring champagne bottles, while the youngest son of the colonel selected them, the corks and the bottles. He also saw wine caves or cellars close to the press house being blasted and excavated by Chinese laborers. They were 26 feet wide, 13 feet in height, and 300 feet long. If you were to visit today, and I really encourage you to make an appointment, especially to Buena Vista, you can see the work themselves. And the Chinese usually worked for 75 cents a day, white workers at least $2. The only difference was Charles Krug at his St. Helena winery paid them the going rate of $2 a day. He is quoted as saying that they took up work that no white man desired to do, dirty and dangerous work, menial work. Later, in the 1880s, even though the Exclusion Act forced many Chinese men to return to China, there were still enough of them around to clear land and to continue to work. And again, I'm sorry that I couldn't find a photo of the man I'm going to talk about, but this is Chavot Winery. When the wife of the owner, Joshua Chavot, died of pneumonia in 1876, it was a Chinese worker called Moon Young that actually took the child in himself and raised him. And he became recognized as an expert winemaker and brandy distiller whose work gained international acclaim and recognition. Although, again, there was really extreme prejudice against the Chinese at this time, he was actually allowed to have a Christian burial and is in a Christian cemetery till then. Up until then, it was literally prohibited to bury the Chinese. And it was in 2004, the book I talked about, The Beasts of the Field, that Richard Stephen Street noted that Between 1856 and 1869, the Chinese planted the majority of Sonoma County's 3.2 million grapevines. They also tore out a lot of the old ones and planted new varietals. However, as the vineyards grew, so did backlash against the Chinese on the West Coast. Anti-Chinese leagues were formed in many counties, with whites accusing Chinese of undercutting wages. Asians, again, by this time were only getting about 30 per month, while white workers were paid up to 50 monthly. And others complained that the Chinese refused to assimilate and to learn the local culture. So racism was common in almost all of those areas. One of the notable things about Sonoma was they saw things differently. There was virtually no organized anti-Chinese agitation in the valley, unlike elsewhere. And Herrazi himself refused to stop hiring Chinese, even though he was encouraged to do so. He literally had to carry a gun with him all the time. He eventually escaped, and those were his words, to Nicaragua, where, sorry to say, he was eaten by a crocodile. Meanwhile, in wine country, and almost every place else, I want you to say that California really led the way. The majority of Chinese lived in California. Nativism really took root. And by 1877, lawmakers in Washington, D.C. had debated a bill to stop Chinese immigration. There was only one newspaper that was against it, the Sacramento Bee. Valentine McClatchy, very pro for it. And he explained that the growers were really dependent on the 500 laborers, and that without them, the wineries would all have to close. They also discussed forbidding any provisions, forbidding the employment of Chinese. They prohibited them from fishing Chinese or California waters, from buying, holding, or leasing property or real estate. And when the convention brought all these provisions up for final approval, he spoke long and passionately. So I have to say that I was going to read from him, but I'd rather get to some of your questions. The Chinese were still desired as workers in the wine industry by their employers. How often that soon changed. There were a group of white men called sandlotters that, again, thought that workers were taking away their jobs, and they started forming together. There were some lynchings, some murders. This even occurred in Sacramento County, in Orangeville. It was in 1882 that the New York Times ran an article on anti-Chinese protests, and that evolved into what we heard earlier, the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So spurred on by Dennis Kearney's Workingmen's Party, and this was a labor-oriented political party, Congress eventually passed the act. There was a movement to forcibly remove all the Chinese from Sonoma by starving them out. And there were signs everywhere that said, don't hire, don't patronize any shops that hire Chinese. And during that period, a lot of Chinese actually left Sonoma. Some say that they were reduced to having to chew weeds down by the riverside, riverbanks to support themselves. And suddenly, according to census data, and that is some of the only records that we have, Sonoma's population dropped from 1,145 to less than 200 by 1930. Prohibition obviously also put a nail in the coffin. I have to say that a revival didn't really begin to occur until 1943, when we interned all of the Japanese and we suddenly needed workers. And again, if it wasn't for an influx of Chinese and the Mexican bracero program to work not only in agriculture, but in the limited wine that we had, those would have laid fallow. And this is just some of the other horrible thing that was said. And that leads us to today. There's a new renaissance. Literally, the reason that I talked about being down there in 1971 is the wine industry didn't really start to revive until well into the late 60s and 70s. Only 24 wineries ended up staying. There are now so many that we can't mention. One of the things that surprised me about it, however, is that when we think of wines, and I'm sure you're all thinking of your favorite, it's usually a family winery, or you think it's a family winery. You've been drinking it for forever and ever. More and more, those are owned by Chinese companies. In fact, over 25% of Napa County counties, approximately 40,000 acres of vineyards are owned or operated by English, Australian, French, Japanese, and the Swiss. And the two biggest are Diageo, which is a UK-based giant that owns Burger King, and the Australian beer brand Foster's, and they own Sterling, Mum Napa Valley, and others. My favorite was Stag's Leap. I used to go there all the time for special events, for senior learning opportunities like we're doing today, and that's now owned by a big conglomerate as well. Things again kind of changed. In 2014, the Cal China Wine Cultural Exchange is a nonprofit that operates in Napa. It was created with the idea of fostering improved cultural exchange between China and the United States through wine tourism and education. And there are a number of wineries. I've brought some with me, or one today to show you. Helen and Stanley Chang founded Heston Vineyards in 1996 out of their passion for wine. Today the estate is totally green, it's solar powered and sustainably farmed. There is also Moon Sai. This is actually a picture of the cultural center as it's supposed to look when it's finally built. Nine Suns was named after a Chinese myth about an archer who shot down 9 sunbirds, and produces boutique small lot Cabernet. At the PA Vineyards, Vanessa Wong, and some of these are actually Chinese winemakers and Napa owners. She does an incredible Chardonnay. Xunyi Cellars was founded by George Zhang in 2019 with a Japanese man by the name of Brian Kasegi, and it's named after the residents of Zhang's hometown in Jinan, China. And they also do small quantities. Tobias Glen was founded by Janie Wu and Christina Lau, and NBA star, there he is. Some of you might recognize him from the NBA. NBA star Yao Ming's passion for Napa Valley wines led him to establish an estate. Today, his Cabernets recently received 90 points from the Wine Spectre wine enthusiast Robert Parker, and more. It is expected that the Chinese will purchase even more vineyards in California, and many more of our wines will be exported. And one of the things that I have to say is that that is also extended to China itself. So I'm sorry, I thought I had a slide here, but I might not. This is Davisville. That is extended to China itself. China, and this is something that surprised me, grows more grapes than any other region now except for Spain. It is the fastest growing crop in China, and wine is becoming to be the drink of choice for Chinese, especially young people. So it's growing and growing. They're starting to buy out major vineyards in Australia, major vineyards in Bordeaux and in Spain, and will probably dominate the market pretty soon. One of the things I hope that you will visit, again, I said the Buena Vista market. It's where I go next, and I was asked earlier from Jerry what I was planning on doing. The other thing I found out from this is just what role the Chinese played really in agriculture closer to home. In yellow, this is Davisville. They built not only the railroad and the structures, but did a lot of work on the packing sheds. And I want to tell the story of asparagus, which includes a story of not only 2 men, and I don't know why it's 2 different men that were known as the Asparagus King. One is Zhao Zhou. He ended up starting in a winery in Marysville and then ended up becoming an asparagus king going south. And then the other is Thomas Foon Chu, and he was literally in the Delta. I really want to tell that story, and the story especially of asparagus, maybe with some asparagus recipes, because that industry is one that crosses all immigrant lines, starting from the Chinese, going to the Japanese, Filipinos, and now Mexican workers. So one last thing, if you have stories, and I do hope we're going to be able to open this up to questions, but if you have stories to share about yourself or an ancestor, I'm hoping that I can talk ACC to start actually capturing those stories here in the late summer or early fall. I can be contacted at rscafesac@gmail.com or contact ACC and they'll connect with us. This is a continuation of a project that I did with Elaine Cord called We Are Where We Eat. We have already done more than 70 interviews, and again, I really hope to capture more of those stories. And now I'm hoping that we have the ability to get some questions answered. Do we have any? I'm going to give it a minute, and if not, I'm just going to encourage everyone, again, to gather the material that you have of your ancestors in whatever occupation that they were in, whether they were dentists or doctors, optometrists, if they worked in pharmacies, if they had Chinese grocery stores, if they were Japanese, any Asian American, American Pacific Islander, please preserve those stories. And thank you. Till next time, which is in June.
I have a question.
Okay.
On your story gathering, are you putting together a compendium? Are you planning to publish? Or what are you going to do with all these stories?
Oh, so I do have to say that a lot of the stories that have been collected were already on Capital Public Radio. They have 12 different talks. There are 70 more interviews that are in archives and on tapes that we collect. We always make sure that the stories go to the right archive. So if the story happened in the Delta, it goes to the Sacramento River Delta Historical Society. If it was in Marysville, to the appropriate one there. In answer to, do I want to tell these stories? Yes, I would love to. But I would love to see if there's a way that we can include those photographs and other types of artifacts that were left by family and have that be an interactive book as well as a photo book. So thanks for that question.
I have a comment.
Yes.
I'm Leong. I'm the president of the the Vallejo Napa Chinese Club.
Thank you.
And we are presently working with Napa, the city of Napa, to put up some signage about the Chinese contributions to the Napa Valley. And one of the people that's working with me is John McCormick, who did a master's thesis on the forgotten Chinese from 1880 to I think 1910. So we're working on that, and hopefully we can get that done. It's not a pavilion of any sort, but we want to have there's a moon. If you go to First Street in Napa, there's what they call Moon Gate, and if you look down on Moon Gate is where the Napa Chinatown was, and it's been sort of the area has been. I guess the river has been rerouted, so there's no way that anybody knows where the Chinese were, and so we're trying to publicize that. They did a lot of work, not only on vineyards, but they also grew hops, and they worked in the quicksilver mines.
In fact, I meant to mention both of them, but I was trying to get some questions in. And correct me if I am wrong, but I believe that 80% of all the leaseholders for hops were actually Chinese, that was the one thing that they could do as a business. So the story of hops And again, the minds are really important. I'm trying to collect all of it. It's not just the food. This was hard to do in 45 minutes. I would love to meet with you and talk to you, share some of the other material I have and gather more so I can just improve this talk. So again, it was rscafesac@gmail.com. So thank you so much for joining us today. And there are other culinary historians I know that we're going to be here. If you need to correct me, please do by sending an email to that address. Thank you. Good. Are there any more? So I think not. Again, I wanted to just mention that there is going to be the, and I'm going to get the title, but it's the annual day of cooking on April 21st. I was lucky to be able to score one of the few spots, the big day of cooking. It is a hybrid event, and I was able to score one of them. I had to cancel an event to be here. And I'm going to be giving what I hope is a kind of a hefty check that day to honor those cooks especially. And I really encourage you to sign in for that day, to be able to watch those classes and to contribute as well, and to take a look on the website and to see the other ways that you can give through this whole month of giving. And again, thank you. See you in June.